Hello, everyone, and welcome to Uplift at Home. My name is Catherine Straight. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the training coordinator for Uplift Center for Grieving Children in Philadelphia. This is the first video training in a series for adults, and I want to say a very special thank you right now to all of the helpers among us who are taking the time to tune in. So the helping professionals, the healthcare professionals, the educators, the therapists, the social workers, the counselors, thank you. I know you are all giving so many people in your life right now everything that you've got and probably a lot of what you don't. And so thank you so much for all you're doing for everyone. So to everyone, welcome. Normally we would be together in person for this training, and so this will be a little different, especially for those of you who have been with me before, and we're allowed to acknowledge that. And so today we are going to spend a lot of time not ignoring the elephant in the room of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're actually going to take it and think about it in the context of what Uplift does every day, which is grief and loss and trauma. And so that said, I really want to encourage you just to take a quick 5-second pause wherever you are when you're listening to this. Just try to check in with your body a little bit, maybe check in with your breathing, or if that doesn't feel comfortable, maybe check in with your environment using your senses of smell and touch. I'm going to use this opportunity to get a drink of water. And as always, I really want to encourage you to take care of yourself during our time together today. This might mean taking a break from this video. That might mean pausing to drink some water, to take some really deep diaphragmatic breaths from your belly, to maybe even stop and come back to this a different day. It is allowed to give yourself what you need, and we will be here whenever you are ready. So, like I said, welcome. Maybe you're listening to this while you are on your way home, driving or on SEPTA or public transit from yet another day as an essential employee. And once again, thank you for risking so much so that our communities can stay safe. Maybe you're listening today as a caregiver or parent and you are just trying to get through the day with the kids home from school for probably what feels like the 100th day in a row. Maybe your place of employment is closed, or maybe you've been furloughed or laid off. Maybe you're not able to work right now and you're really wishing that you could. Maybe you have more work than you can handle right now and you're wishing it would calm down. Maybe you're an educator and you've either been teaching remotely for a couple of weeks or you're beginning to, and you're being forced to learn a brand new skill of remote teaching in the middle of a global crisis, which you did not sign up for. Maybe your child or children attend a school within the school district of Philadelphia, and you're really trying to figure out how to get them a Chromebook right now. Maybe you have the extraordinary privilege, as I do, to be able to do my 9-to-5 work from home. And even though we know we're some of the luckiest ones being able to do this with this privilege, that doesn't make what we're going through easy either. And so we're going to work on not minimizing that today, no matter who you are or what you're going through. Maybe you're working from home and you have the kids home from school and you're the default parent or the default caregiver. And so you are trying to parent and work and help kids with remote learning, whatever that looks like, all at the same time. Those are 3 jobs, and those actually cannot be done at the same time. And so to all of us who are in any of those situations or any ones I didn't even describe, this is not hard because we're doing it wrong. This is hard because this is just too much. And so no matter who you are or what you're dealing with right now, this COVID-19 pandemic is not easy for any of us. And so, of course, we are struggling. None of this is normal. And so we believe at Uplift that the most compassionate choice right now and always is to tell the truth. And right now, that truth is that we're grieving. We are all grieving right now. In our work at Uplift, we have the huge honor of working with kids and young people who are grieving a significant death of someone or many someones in their life. And so in all of our work, we define grief, which you may have seen before, as, can we see this? Grief is all the thoughts, feelings, and behavior that happen to us after someone dies. We know that grief is the natural response to the death of someone, or the loss of something, or even the loss of someone who maybe hasn't died, but they're still gone, in whatever way that might be true in a situation. Maybe we are grieving the death of someone. Maybe this death happened long before the COVID-19 pandemic ever came. And if that's true for you, we're going to have another video in our training series entitled Continuing Your Grief or Your Trauma Healing Journey Through the COVID-19 Pandemic, because there's a lot of implications for those of us, and we might not be experiencing the pandemic in the same way that other people are, and that's okay. So we're going to talk about that in a different video, so please stay tuned for that. Maybe a death just happened in your life. Maybe someone died from the coronavirus, or maybe someone died from something completely unrelated, because those tragedies are also still happening right now. Maybe someone died from a long illness, or a very sudden abrupt illness, or an accident. Maybe someone died by suicide. Maybe someone was killed by gun violence. Maybe someone in your life died from a substance use disorder or an overdose. No matter when a death happened in your life or how that person died, we really want you to know that you are never alone, even when it feels very, very much like you are. Maybe no one has died that you personally know, but people in your community, in your city, in your town, in your region have died. And so you might not know them, but you know it's happening, and you're maybe weighed down with that heaviness, or maybe you're just completely oversaturated and you're unable to process each and every death. There's no more space left. Maybe you're facing losses that aren't the death of someone. Maybe you or someone you love has lost their health. Maybe you or someone you love is at greater risk for the coronavirus, and you're facing a loss of normalcy, a loss of safety, or a loss of your peace of mind. All of those are very valid losses. Maybe you've lost your job or your business. Maybe you've had a pay cut. Maybe you're expected to output more right now for work and you're getting paid less or not at all until this is all over. Maybe your work is impacted and maybe it isn't. Maybe you already weren't working, or maybe you're not right now even though you were. All of those losses are very real. And for all of us, in some ways, in different ways, we've lost predictability. And we have lost whatever normal looked like before this pandemic. And all of those losses are very real and still have a very real impact on us, even if no one has died. And then we have those losses that some people might refer to as a silent loss. And so those are things like all those graduations that have had to been canceled or postponed or are somehow going to be done over the internet. Not quite sure how that's going to work. My goodness, my heart is with you. Maybe your wedding had to be postponed, or the wedding of someone close to you has had to be rescheduled, and it is so hard to possibly know when to reschedule for. Maybe you were really looking forward to a trip for months, and it was the thing that you were thinking about every night when you went to bed, and now it's had to be canceled. Maybe you're feeling really isolated, and you really miss your colleagues, or your friends, or your neighbors, or your teachers, or your family. Maybe you missed the period of time between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. when the kids would normally have been in school and you were allowed to be an adult, whatever that time looked like for you. And we may worry that other people might find these silent losses insignificant, or maybe we've even told ourselves that we're not allowed to miss those things because others are facing far more tragic circumstances. But these losses, no matter what anybody says about them, or no matter what that voice in your head says to you, they are still valid, and they're still affecting us in very deep and important ways. And so whatever your losses are during this time, as you've seen, there's such a large scope of what you might be going through, and there might be losses I haven't even mentioned, but they're there, and we're grieving them, whether we acknowledge them or not. And there's a few things about this word grief, this beast of a thing, that are really important to keep in mind right now. The first one is that grief is different for all of us. We're different people. We're actually supposed to be different. We were never intended to be the same, even though For maybe some of us, we were taught from a very young age by society that different equals weird, but we know that that's just incorrect. But because we're different and unique people from each other, our grief is going to be different and unique too. And so we each have our very own timelines of processing, and there is no right or wrong way to do it. It's only whatever is true for you. And so even if a family or a community is grieving the same person or the same loss, all of them might be grieving it in a very different way, and they're all still doing it correctly. The next thing that I want to make sure we talk about with grief is that as a society, we do a terrible job with grief. We're so bad at it. We have a systematic fear in our society, and we avoid everything grief and death that we possibly can avoid. And so some of us like to refer to this as like a grief-phobic culture. And that is a huge disservice that society does for us. And especially for our children, absolutely. And so because we live in this society that's afraid of grief, we are taught that, we're socialized within that society, we absorb that, and it manifests itself in so many ways. And so we try to protect the children around us, and we say all sorts of things instead of having to say to them, so-and-so just died. And so we say things like, they went to sleep, or they're no longer with us. Doesn't that sound lovely? And separately, this would be a separate training. And so if you have any questions about this, I really would love for you to contact me because I would love to talk more about that with you. But please be as direct and matter of fact with children about losses regarding death or about losses that they're facing right now as much as you possibly can be, because a lot of children are very concrete thinkers. And so being told that someone went to sleep or being told that someone's just no longer with us might not mean anything, or it might mean something very scary to them. And so the final video in this series is going to be all about supporting youth, children, and young people moving through this pandemic with their grief and their losses. And we'll talk more about that then, but you're welcome to contact me if you have any questions. And so we tell children these things because we don't want to say them out loud. We don't want to harm them, even though it's the truth of what happened, right? We don't really always know what to write in sympathy cards to newly bereaved people in our life. I know for me, before I got this job and I was forced to confront all my grief baggage, I did this like very awkward dance around like how to bring up the person who died in conversation with a grieving person. And I was so afraid of reminding someone about the person who died. And I think back to that now, and I realize that that is such a fantasy because I have yet to meet a grieving person, and I think I speak for all of my colleagues, who have forgotten that someone died. If you're grieving, you know this. We don't just forget that the death happened. And so other people reminding us of it is not really a thing. What grieving people really want, from what I have learned from so many that I've been honored to work with, from what we know for those of us who are grieving ourselves, a lot of times the truth of the matter is that we want others to say the name of the person who died. We want others to acknowledge that they did exist. And so, but because in society we're so uncomfortable with grief, very often we then become uncomfortable with grieving people. And so people might start avoiding grieving people or not knowing how to be with them because they can't fix it and they can't make it better. And out of this discomfort, grieving people are sometimes isolated, and especially children, but anybody might feel like, well, the rest of the world just moved on and I'm expected to too. And so it's almost like people around us are worried that this grief is contagious, that they might catch it. And we put so much energy into avoiding grief in our society, into suppressing it. And guess what? We actually know how to grieve. It is something that is naturally deep within us, and we do. Every single person does have the capacity to move through it. But it is that suppression of grief, being made to feel like we're not supposed to be feeling the way that we're feeling, that massive denial and our grief being widely dismissed, that is what's so toxic. That is what poisons us. It's not the grief. It's the running from it. It's the huge dismissal of it. That's what can actually destroy us. And so, what would happen if we took maybe like a fraction of the energy we spend into dismissing and avoiding grief and loss, and we used a fraction of that energy and instead we allowed it? What if we just acknowledged it for ourselves and for others? What if we took the unthinkable tragedies that this pandemic is forcing us through and we decided to get better at sitting with our grief collectively? What a remarkable gift we would give ourselves and all of our communities. The next thing that I want to make sure we talk a little bit about is that grief doesn't actually end. And so it might change as we grow and change, and sometimes these changes might happen quickly or slowly or maybe even not at all for everybody. But grief doesn't go away, and we grieve our losses or we grieve people who have died forever. And it's tricky because society and because we're manifestations of society, we want grief to be this like very straightforward, very straight line of a process. And we want it to be linear, to be one thing right after the other. We want grief to get better and better each day, and every year that passes for it to get easier and easier. And that is not how grief works. Grief is a roller coaster, and there are some days that we might be like way up here with it, and we're like, you know what? We're grieving, we own that, but we feel grounded and we can take this on, we can accomplish anything. And then there are days down here where everything is crumbling and we collapse right along with it. And I don't know about you, but that's actually how my life is feeling right now, where some days I'm okay and some days I'm not. And so what we know is that grief can get triggered by all sorts of different things, by different places, by different outlets, but sometimes it's triggered by seemingly nothing. And so supposedly the trigger was there, but we have no idea what it is. And so at random moments, on random days, we might feel our grief cascade over us and wash out everything from us until we just feel empty. And everything is in agony, even though nothing new happened that day. But all of that is actually correct. That is actually exactly the way that grief works. Grief becomes a part of us, and it changes us very deeply. Megan Devine, in their book, wrote that the reality of grief is far different from what others see from the outside. There is pain in this world that you can't be cheered out of. You don't need solutions. You don't need to move on from your grief. You need someone to see your grief, to acknowledge it. You need someone to hold your hands while you stand there in blinking horror, staring at the hole that was your life. Some things cannot be fixed. They can only be carried. And all of this is true in our current pandemic. We cannot fix the pandemic, and we cannot fix the grief that it is bringing us. We can only figure out ways to carry it with us. And because we carry our grief with us into the future and whatever it holds, there is never any reason, clinical, therapeutic, or otherwise, for us to get over our grief or for us to move on from it. And so sometimes people say that to us and they might ask like, how come you're not over that yet? Like you need to kind of like, hurry that up. And sometimes we even say it to ourselves. We totally minimize what we're going through because maybe others have it worse. And so we set impossible expectations for us to get over our grief when we barely have taken the time we need to acknowledge that we lost something in the first place. And so when other people say that or imply that to you, I don't know if that person is saying it to you to be mean, or maybe even they think that they're being helpful. I don't have those answers. But I do know that they're just incorrect. It's not possible to get over our grief. And so we don't have to listen when others say that. We are allowed to detach with love, or maybe detach with not love. And we can remind ourselves that only we know the truth of our own grief. And we can choose to simply not engage in these oppression Olympics and these competitions of whose story is worse, whose grief is deeper. All of our grief is real, even though it's different. And refusing to acknowledge our own grief, that minimizing that we do, it doesn't actually produce solidarity with others who are also suffering, maybe even in what we think are larger ways. And that is a lesson I have had to learn the very hard way, and I still have to learn it every day. The other thing that I want to say about this is that we know, and this is especially apparent for those of us who work or exist within systems of oppression on a daily basis, is that this pandemic is not an equal opportunity virus. We know that whatever was present before the pandemic is going to be extremely amplified right now. And so that absolutely includes systems of privilege and oppression. And so I am a cisgender white woman. And so there is a lot, there is so much I will never truly understand about what it means to experience not even this pandemic, but society as a member of a marginalized community, because I am not a member of those communities. And I am not a Black or brown person. And so I only know what it is like for me. But I do think that we can all appreciate that this involves even more levels of grief for our fellow human beings who were never safe in this society to begin with, long before we had ever even heard of the coronavirus. And so for me, and for those of us with privilege, I'm taking this as a call to get very deliberate with continuing to confront my white privilege, continuing to confront my income privilege, continuing to confront my cis privilege. Otherwise, I risk doing so much harm, always, and especially now, particularly in my work with young people who may or may not feel that they can trust what's being shared right now. And so given all of this that we've talked about, our bodies and brains are going through a lot. So maybe you're not able to sleep very well right now, or maybe you're sleeping a lot more than you normally would. Maybe your appetite has kind of gone away, or maybe you're eating more than you usually would, or maybe you're eating a lot of carbs or sugar or salt right now. And that's actually a thing. When our bodies are stressed, we have these physiological cravings for those kinds of foods. Like that's embedded within us. That's not just like you being weak or not having any willpower. That is embedded within our physiology. Maybe you're having a really hard time focusing and you're not feeling very motivated to get done what you need to. Maybe you're hyper-focusing when you're doing something because that distraction and illusion of control can feel helpful sometimes. Maybe your brain feels kind of foggy, like you're really off or just not with it. Maybe your baseline anxiety is higher than usual, or maybe you're experiencing anxiety for the very first time and the racing thoughts that come along with that. Maybe your baseline depression is higher than usual, or maybe you're experiencing depression for the very first time and it feels like all the color has gone out of the world. Maybe you're feeling overwhelmed. Maybe you can't figure out how to keep your body still. Maybe you feel uncomfortable in your own skin right now. Maybe your emotions feel like they're flooding everything in your life. They're on absolutely the highest level of volume they possibly could be. Or maybe you feel numb and you don't feel much of anything at all. Maybe you're dissociating and you feel like you're kind of watching yourself above you from the ceiling. Or maybe you're moving through your days with what feels like a really thick piece of glass between you and the rest of the world. Maybe you can't stop crying, or maybe you haven't cried at all, or maybe you're somewhere in the middle. Maybe your stress about the pandemic is being displaced in other areas of your life. Maybe you're clinging to certainty wherever you can find it. Maybe you lost your temper about a sock being left on the floor. Maybe you're consumed with everyone else's needs, so you don't even know how you're doing yet. Maybe you're actually doing okay right now, but in 1 or 2, or maybe even in 5 months when hopefully the kids are back in school and things may return to normal, maybe then you will feel the current losses for the truth of what they've been for you. And maybe you're holding it all together for everyone else right now until it feels safe for you to finally fall apart. And maybe you're experiencing things I haven't even mentioned. All of it is normal, and all of it is expected for the level of crisis we're in the middle of. Of course, these things are happening to you. They are the normal, appropriate response to a crisis of this magnitude. It makes so much sense that you're feeling this way or that these things are happening to your brain or to your body. And now is the time more than ever before to give ourselves the grace that I know you are constantly extending to other people. And so this brings me to another concept, another thing that happens to us when the unthinkable happens. And that is trauma. And that's a word we use when everything just feels like too much. Trauma is what happens when things out of our control overwhelm what our brain can take in. So we simply aren't able to process such an overload all at once. It's sort of our brain's response to a terrifying event or a series of events that overwhelms our resources to cope with it, which makes it very, very subjective and unique for each person. That is exactly what is happening here for so many of us. We are moving through a collective traumatic experience right now. And when trauma happens to us, our bodies activate our central nervous system and we're thrown into what we will call survival behavior. And survival behavior looks different for everyone, just like grief. And it often involves a fight, flight, freeze, or appease response from our sympathetic nervous systems. If you're more interested in all of that, please call me. We can chat all about it. And so this means that our stress hormones, our cortisol and our adrenaline, they have flooded our brains and flooded our bodies. And those are very hard at work trying to keep us alive. But for most of us, our day-to-day responsibilities have not changed. They haven't gone away. If anything, they're more now. And maybe even the list of people you support outside of your job has gotten even longer during this pandemic. And so the things that were hard for us before the pandemic, like maybe a relationship in your life or maybe taking care of yourself, those things are going to be even harder for us now. And for reasons that have nothing to do with our abilities or intelligence. Those of us who are therapists, who are educators, who are social workers, clinicians, counselors, teachers, we are also being forced to learn brand new, very difficult skills to do our work in ways we've never had to do before, often involving teletherapy or remote teaching. And so our brains are trying to survive, and that involves our brainstem, which is way back here, the first part of our brain to develop when we're infants. But we're forcing ourselves to activate our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that's required for higher order thinking. And so that's essentially like looking at a hugely powerful waterfall gushing down miles of rocks and getting in a boat and forcing your body upstream. And that's what so many of us are doing right now, every single day, on top of the normal responsibilities we already had, which were probably never easy to begin with because life is hard. And we're wondering, why are we so exhausted? Why can't we be productive during this time? Why do we feel so depleted? Of course we are struggling. The fact that we're even making it through every day is absolutely magnificent, and it really deserves to be acknowledged as such. And so, like I say, here's the thing about grief. We can't fix it. We can't reassure it away. We can't cheer it up. I can't make this global crisis better. None of us can make it go away. I can't compete with the universe or all the things outside of my control. And believe me, I have tried, and it does not work. And that's the thing about those of us who are helpers. We want so badly to fix this, but we can't. And this is showing up in all sorts of ways across the internet and social media, encouraging us to use this time to throw ourselves into hobbies and side hustles and make ourselves into machines of productivity. And many of us cope by being busy, by staying busy. And so this might feel good in the short term, actually. But an article from the Chronicle of Higher Education recently shared, global catastrophes change the world, and this pandemic is very much akin to a major war. Even if we contain the COVID-19 pandemic within a few months, the legacy of this pandemic will live with us for years, perhaps decades to come. It will change the way we move, build, learn, and connect. There's simply no way that our lives will resume as if this had never happened. And so, while it may feel good in the moment, it is foolish to dive into a frenzy of activity or obsess about your productivity right now. That is denial and delusion. The emotionally and spiritually sane response is to prepare to be forever changed. I have had to make it part of my morning self-care to read this quote every day because shifting my own expectations of my own productivity has very much become a necessity. And preparing to be forever changed, as it says, involves acknowledging that for this pandemic, there is more of this grief to come. And we owe it to ourselves to begin grieving now, to begin acknowledging the truth of what is happening so that we're prepared for whatever comes next. For all that you have given to others in this time and for the many lifetimes of service I know you have given before we got here, we owe ourselves that gift of the truth. So I'm wondering right now, what is happening for you? What losses has this pandemic brought into your life? What has it taken away from you? And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to write down what is honestly happening to us. There's a lot of really amazing research out there about how the actual act of writing has an incredibly therapeutic impact on us because it's releasing and freeing. There's something about the way that the thoughts in our mind utilize our bodies to make it visible, and it really connects our whole being in both hemispheres of our brain. So whatever writing looks like for you, because it looks different for everyone, maybe it's a pen and paper, maybe it's on your phone or on your computer or on a technological or communication device, whatever it is. For me, I have the huge privilege of being able to use pen and paper. I'm going to write loss at the top of one paper. Now, I had construction paper lying around because I work with kids, but you can use whatever paper you have. And I want you to do the same on yours for whatever that looks. And on this paper, we're going to write down the actual words of the things, the people, the places, the concepts, the trips, the graduations, the jobs, the health, the safety, the normalcy, the routines, whatever we have lost. What have you lost? What's been taken from you? Who have you lost? What are you in the process of currently losing? What are you worried about losing? What do you miss even if it's not gone forever? Who do you long for, or what do you long for that you can't do right now? It's going to be different for everyone because we're different people who process things in different ways. So there are going to be some of us who are listening right now and they're thinking to themselves, oh my gosh, this is the most depressing thing I've ever heard. I do not know why this crazy lady is asking me to do this. I want to acknowledge that and tell you, I really do hear you. I absolutely hear you. And you know what? You're right. This is not going to be easy because it's not supposed to be. Grief is not easy. And it might be hard to write these things down. It might bring up lots of emotions for us. And that's okay. And that's allowed. But running away from them is actually a lot harder. Much of the process of self-reflection can be really excruciating in the short term, but it pays off in the long term. I can't guarantee any of this personal work is going to be easy, but I can promise you that it will be worth it. So I really encourage you to dig deep and to give yourself this gift of the truth. You're worth it and you deserve it, even if it's really painful right now. And so if you're doing this in real time while you're listening, I'm going to ask that you pause this video because I'm not going to just stare at you and be super creepy while you're doing intensive personal reflection. And then when you're ready to move on, I'm going to ask that we now do the same thing with a new piece of paper or new tab or new email draft or new device screen, however it looks, and we're going to write the word grief at the top of this second page. Can you see that? And on this one, we're going to write what our grief, only our own, is like right now. What does your grief look like right now? Does it have a shape? An energy? A gap? Is it empty? Or is it full? Let's go back to our definition just for 1 second. What thoughts are part of your grief right now? What feelings are coming up for you? And what behaviors feel really true for you right now? Have you shared about your grief out loud with someone you trust? There's never any pressure to do that. It's always your choice if someone has earned the right to hear your story. Have you taken your grief out on anyone? There's no judgment about that. I definitely have. You could ask my spouse in the next room. So as you're ready and as you feel comfortable, I want you to write those things down. If it is true for you, then it is true. There is no right or wrong way to do any of this. You don't have to defend or justify your grief to anyone. It is yours and only yours, and it is allowed to be whatever it needs to be. And so click pause if you're going to do this right now. Come back to us when you're ready. So where does this leave us? For some of us, we have not written a single word down, and that is totally okay. I absolutely see you and honor that. Maybe you think it's silly or unnecessary, or maybe it's deeper than that. So this last thing we're going to talk about together is the barriers that we might be facing right now to be fully acknowledging the truth of our grief for what it is. Because there are a lot of things getting in our way. We live in a grief-phobic society, for one thing. We have been taught to do the opposite of this. But maybe these feelings are just simply too overwhelming for right now. Or maybe we just haven't been able to find the space or time to acknowledge what's happening for us because we've been so focused and concerned about acknowledging it for other people. Maybe we don't have a safe space at home to feel like we can process these things. Or maybe there's other mental health complications getting in our way. Maybe we want a safe person to share it with, but we don't have access to them right now. Or maybe we have not been able to find someone who feels safe. For many of us, a huge barrier might be fear. Fear that talking or writing out our grief makes us weak, which it does not. Or maybe fear that we don't have the capacity to sit with our grief for very long. And to that I say, I totally hear that, but I know that you can. And I know that you have everything within you that you need, even if it only is just for a minute a day. This pandemic is presenting us with a few choices. We can make the incredibly courageous, extraordinarily brave decision to take a deep breath and to allow ourselves, even if it's just for a minute, to grieve, to sit with those feelings, to lean into the agony and anguish and emptiness, to acknowledge the truth to ourselves that I am grieving these losses. I am grieving this person or people who are important to me. I am grieving losses that this pandemic has taken away from me. Grief changes us, and it is okay if we're not okay right now. Or we can make the choice to run. And you know what? That happens, and that's allowed. We're human beings, and we run all the time. And there are all sorts of valid reasons why it might not feel safe for you to grieve right now, and I completely honor that. We're not always ready. I actually ran for a really long time. I had this belief in my head that if I ran fast enough, if I worked hard enough, if I loved fully enough, if I made myself perfect enough, that I wouldn't have to face my vulnerabilities. And I'm going to be honest with you, it did work, but only for a little while. I discovered that we either make the time now or we make the time later. Because grief always finds us. It catches up to us eventually. We either run out of breath or we run out of space to run. The body keeps the score, which is actually the title of a book written by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And it does not lie about where we truly are with our grief, even if our mind hasn't caught up yet. So look back at those words of yours, your grief and your loss. What is the risk for you, only for you, in the long term of avoiding your grief right now? Sometimes we make the choice to allow ourselves to grieve when we're fully and truly ready, and that's great. Get there when you get there. But for many of us, we only allow ourselves and acknowledge our grief because circumstances force us to. And for many of us, this is one of those circumstances. I heard a very wise person recently say, we can build a dam, but the water has to go somewhere. And so my question for you is, what choice will you make for yourself today? We're already grieving. It's happening. Whether we acknowledge it or not, we are moving through this. And we're not alone. The entire world, all of our communities are grieving too. We are in this together, quite literally, but we were never, ever meant to grieve all by ourselves. So back to my question. What is the choice that you're going to make for yourself today? Just for today, are you able to allow yourself to grieve those losses you're facing? I don't know if that day for you is today, or if it's tomorrow, or if it's a different day later on. But what I do know is that whenever that day is, you are allowed to give your body and your brain the gift of hearing the truth. Denying your own pain is an extraordinarily excruciating process. And I don't wish that for anyone, but I do know that some of our journeys take us there. For many of us, acknowledging and allowing our grief might be the biggest relief for our bodies and for our brains, because we're telling ourselves that it's okay. It's okay that we're not okay, as that book title says. We don't have to be perfect. We don't have to be super strong every single moment of this for everyone else, because it's not actually possible. That's asking ourselves to do an impossible job. This pandemic is not your fault, and so it is therefore not your job to undo the damage caused by a massively pervasive virus that has taken over the globe. Everything has turned upside down, and we can't fix that through hard work. And honestly, sometimes I wish that we could, but it's not the truth, and deep down, we know that. None of us asked for this, because no one ever asks for grief. Acknowledging our grief doesn't make us bad, and it doesn't make us weak, and it doesn't mean we're not enough if we feel that emptiness and that loss. It's actually one of the very, very bravest things you could ever do. The most compassionate choice for ourselves is almost always going to be to tell ourselves the truth. And right now, that truth is grief. And so we're going to wrap up for today. I want to remind us that when we are aware of what is happening to us and we acknowledge our own grief, we often receive the freedom we seek by trying to avoid it in the first place. And so once we have written it down, once we can mention it out loud, maybe it's just to ourselves, we don't have to share it with someone else, but we can move towards making it more manageable one day at a time. And in this way, I really want to encourage you to tune in for our second video, which is all about self-care and managing these huge beasts called grief and trauma. And that video is the second session in our series. It's up. It's called Taking Care of Ourselves When the Rest of the World Expects Us to Take Care of Them. And so normally in a training together, we would have spent this entire time learning about each other. And I would really love to get to hear from you, even though we can't do that virtually right this moment. And so please email me, call me, tell me about how the grief and trauma of this pandemic is shifting your work or the way that you support those around you. My contact information is on the screen, and I would always only be grateful to hear from you. So in parting, I want to remind you that we may not be coping with our grief in this pandemic as well as we'd like, but we are coping, and that's really what matters. I'm going to adapt the words of the illustrious Mr. Fred Rogers and say that you are already more than enough, exactly the way that you are. Looking forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much. Be gentle with yourselves.